Rome did not fall asleep suddenly. It stayed awake, alert, informed, surrounded by reports, warnings, messengers, debates, and voices. But its mind never truly woke up. The danger was not hidden in darkness. It stood in plain sight, repeating itself year after year, growing louder with every ignored signal. Rome saw everything coming, and that is precisely why it hesitated. Because when a system has survived too long, awareness turns into complacency, and knowledge becomes a reason to delay rather than to act. This is the paradox of power. The stronger a system becomes, the harder it is for it to believe that it can end. Rome did not lack intelligence, experience, or memory. It lacked urgency. Every threat was measured against the past, every warning compared to previous crises that had already been overcome. And because Rome had survived before, it assumed survival was inevitable. The Senate listened, discussed, archived, postponed. They believed time itself was an ally, that delay was wisdom, that caution was stability. But caution slowly transformed into paralysis. The mind of Rome did not panic, did not collapse, did not scream. It remained calm, structured, procedural, and fatally slow. This is how decline truly begins. Not with chaos, but with order that refuses to adapt. The Senate did not ignore danger because it was blind. It ignored danger because acknowledging it fully would mean admitting that the world had changed, and that admission would shatter the foundations of authority built on continuity. Rome trusted its systems more than reality, its traditions more than present conditions, its memory more than evidence. And so warnings became noise, urgency became exaggeration, and those who spoke too early were dismissed as alarmists. The most dangerous moment in history is not when a society is weak, but when it still functions well enough to convince itself that nothing is wrong. Rome was strongest when it became most fragile because its confidence silenced doubt. The Senate believed that time could be managed, threats negotiated, reality delayed. But history does not wait for consensus. Collapse does not ask for permission. It arrives quietly while debates are still ongoing, while protocols are still followed, while everyone agrees that there is still time. Rome did not fail because it lacked answers. It failed because it asked the wrong questions. Instead of asking what was changing, it asked whether change was truly necessary. Instead of asking how close the danger was, it asked whether the danger fit old patterns. And so the Roman mind stayed awake, but never fully conscious, silent, analytical, confident, and unprepared. What the Senate was and what it was not. The Roman Senate was never designed to be a crisis engine. It was not a command center built for emergencies, sudden transformations, or unpredictable threats. It was, above all else, a memory institution. The Senate represented continuity, lineage, tradition, and inherited authority. It did not exist to imagine the future, but to preserve the past. Senators were not selected for innovation or speed. They were chosen for status, reputation, ancestry, and loyalty to established norms. In this sense, the Senate functioned less like a brain reacting to stimuli, and more like an archive guarding accumulated experience. Its greatest strength was stability, and its greatest weakness was that same stability when conditions changed. The Senate believed wisdom came from repetition, from precedent, from doing what had worked before. Change was not progress in Roman political culture. It was risk, and risk was seen not as courage, but as irresponsibility. The Senate did not ask what must be done now. It asked what has always been done. This made it effective in times of balance and deeply flawed in moments of disruption. It was not powerless, but it was slow by design. Debate was valued over decisiveness, consensus over speed, dignity over urgency. The Senate believed that authority came from restraint, that hesitation was a sign of intelligence, and that acting too early was more dangerous than acting too late. What the Senate was not is just as important. It was not a unified will. It was not a visionary body. It was not built to respond to asymmetric threats, unconventional enemies, or rapid social shifts. It was not flexible, and it was not meant to be. The Senate saw itself as the guardian of Rome's identity, not the engineer of its adaptation. To admit that Rome needed to fundamentally change was to admit that the Senate itself might no longer be sufficient. And so the institution protected not only the state, but its own relevance. This created a silent conflict between reality and authority. When reality demanded transformation, the Senate offered moderation. When urgency demanded action, the Senate offered discussion. It was an institution optimized for permanence in a world that had begun to accelerate. And because it had worked for centuries, no one inside it believed that its structure could be the problem. The Senate did not fail because it was corrupt or ignorant. It failed because it was exactly what it had always been, an organ of tradition operating in a moment that required reinvention. It has always been this way. The disease. One of the most dangerous illusions in history is the belief that continuity guarantees survival. For the Roman Senate, this belief was not a mistake. It was a habit, slowly turning into a disease. Every crisis was filtered through memory, every threat evaluated against past victories. Rome had faced enemies before. Rome had endured wars, famines, rebellions, conspiracies, and Rome had survived them all. This long record of endurance created a subtle but fatal assumption that survival was automatic, that whatever happened next would simply follow the same pattern as before. The Senate did not consciously deny danger. It reclassified it as familiar. And familiarity breeds delay. When warnings arrived, they were not treated as signals of rupture, but as echoes of earlier problems that had already been solved. The logic was simple and comforting. If Rome overcame this once, it will overcome it again. But history does not repeat itself in identical forms. It mutates, and institutions that expect repetition fail to recognize transformation. This mindset created what can be called the always syndrome. Always we have managed. Always the system has corrected itself. Always the legions have prevailed. Always the republic has endured. These statements were not lies. They were memories. But memory, when mistaken for foresight, becomes blindness. The Senate relied on precedent as if it were a shield, believing that experience alone was enough to navigate new realities. Instead of asking what was different, it asked what was similar. Instead of identifying change, it searched for reassurance. This turned adaptation into resistance. New threats were judged by old standards. Unconventional enemies were measured using outdated assumptions. Structural problems were dismissed because they did not resemble previous collapses. The Senate trusted patterns more than evidence, tradition more than observation. The danger of this disease lies in its subtlety. It does not announce itself as denial. It presents itself as wisdom. Caution appears rational. Skepticism toward alarm seems responsible. Those who warn too early are labeled dramatic, impatient, or politically motivated. In Rome, urgency was often interpreted as ambition, and ambition was feared more than stagnation. It was safer to wait, safer to debate, safer to do nothing than to act decisively and risk being wrong. The Senate believed that time would clarify the situation, but time does not clarify. It amplifies. By the time danger becomes undeniable, options have already narrowed. This mindset also protected power. To accept that this time is different would mean admitting that inherited knowledge was insufficient. It would mean acknowledging that experience had limits, that the world was changing faster than the institution could respond. Such an admission threatens legitimacy, and so the Senate unconsciously defended its authority by defending the idea of continuity. If Rome was still Rome, then the Senate was still necessary. If the rules still worked, then the guardians of those rules remained relevant. The disease of always was not just psychological, it was political. History shows that collapse rarely comes from ignorance. It comes from overconfidence in what once worked. The Roman Senate did not fail because it forgot the past. It failed because it could not imagine a future that broke from it. By the time reality proved that things were no longer the same, the habit of delay had already hardened into destiny. Rome did not fall because it faced unprecedented challenges. It fell because it treated unprecedented challenges as if they were routine. And the phrase, "It has always been this way," quietly became the most dangerous sentence the Senate ever believed. When Hannibal came, when Hannibal began his march toward Rome, the danger did not arrive suddenly. It announced itself slowly, step by step, rumor by rumor, report by report. Messages reached the Senate describing an enemy general doing what no rational commander should attempt, crossing hostile lands, moving without secure supply lines, advancing with elephants through terrain considered impassable. To the Roman mind, this was not a warning, it was a contradiction. And contradictions are easy to dismiss. The Senate did not immediately deny the reports. It diluted them. It questioned the numbers, the logistics, the sanity of the plan. Because if something violates established logic, institutions tend to assume the logic is still right and reality is wrong. Hannibal was not evaluated as a new type of threat. He was interpreted through old assumptions. And that was the first mistake. Rome believed in rules. Armies required roads, supplies, seasons, permission from geography. War followed patterns Rome had mastered. Hannibal ignored those patterns. That alone should have triggered alarm. Instead, it produced disbelief. The Senate asked not whether Hannibal could succeed, but whether such an attempt even deserved serious consideration. Crossing the Alps was treated as theatrical madness rather than strategic intent. The idea that an enemy would willingly endure extreme losses to gain psychological shock was foreign to a system accustomed to measured, institutional warfare. Rome assumed rationality meant predictability. Hannibal proved that rationality could mean something else entirely. But by the time the Senate understood this distinction, the enemy was already inside Italy. As Hannibal advanced, early engagements exposed Roman vulnerability. Defeats mounted. Each one was explained away as an anomaly. A poor commander, bad luck, terrain issues, nothing systemic, nothing fundamental. The Senate reacted to each loss independently, never connecting them into a single pattern of strategic failure. This is how institutions collapse. Not by ignoring evidence, but by fragmenting it until it loses meaning. Hannibal was not just winning battles. He was rewriting the rules of engagement. He understood Roman psychology better than Rome understood him. He knew that Rome trusted procedure, hierarchy, and gradual escalation, so he moved faster than deliberation could follow. While the Senate debated responses, Hannibal dictated tempo. The catastrophe at Cannae was not a surprise in hindsight. It was the inevitable result of delayed recognition. By the time Rome fully mobilized its forces, it did so with arrogance rather than adaptation. The Senate believed mass alone would crush innovation. Numbers would overwhelm strategy. Discipline would defeat cunning. Instead, Hannibal annihilated one of the largest Roman armies ever assembled. The shock was not only military, it was psychological. Rome had not just lost a battle, it had lost certainty. The Senate finally realized that the old assumptions no longer applied. But realization arrived after irreversible damage. Tens of thousands dead, allies wavering, fear spreading. What makes Hannibal's moment so revealing is not that Rome underestimated an enemy. It is that Rome underestimated change. The Senate was slow not because it lacked information, but because the information challenged its worldview. Accepting Hannibal as a genuine existential threat required abandoning comforting beliefs about Roman superiority, predictability, and control. That abandonment did not happen quickly. Institutions do not surrender their self-image easily. Hannibal did not defeat Rome by force alone. He defeated the Senate's imagination. He moved in ways they could not anticipate, because they could not conceive of a world in which the old rules no longer governed outcomes. Even after Cannae, Rome adapted only partially. It learned to avoid direct confrontation, to delay, to exhaust the enemy, but the lesson came at an unbearable cost. Hannibal exposed the fatal lag between awareness and action. He showed that when a system waits for certainty before responding, it hands initiative to those willing to act under uncertainty. The Senate's tragedy was not blindness. It was hesitation disguised as wisdom. Hannibal came not as a storm from nowhere, but as a test of whether Rome could recognize a new reality fast enough to survive it. The answer, at least at first, was no. The psychology of the Senate. The Roman Senate did not think like an individual. It thought like an institution, and that difference mattered. Institutions are not driven by fear or instinct. They are driven by preservation. Every decision the Senate made passed through an invisible filter. What protects the system itself? This is why the Senate's psychology was fundamentally conservative, not in ideology, but in function. Its first reflex was not to solve problems, but to maintain legitimacy, balance, and continuity. Speed was suspicious. Decisiveness was dangerous. Acting too early carried more political risk than acting too late. In the Senate's mind, delay was not failure. It was safety. Admitting a threat was never a neutral act. To acknowledge danger meant acknowledging vulnerability, and vulnerability threatened authority. A senator who warned too loudly risked being seen as irresponsible, ambitious, or destabilizing. Rome feared internal disruption more than external enemies. Civil conflict had scarred the Republic deeply, and the memory of internal collapse shaped every reaction. As a result, unity became more important than accuracy. Consensus mattered more than truth. A wrong decision made together felt safer than a correct decision made alone. This psychology rewarded silence and punished urgency. The Senate also suffered from diffusion of responsibility. No single individual carried full accountability, which meant no single individual felt compelled to act decisively. Responsibility was spread across committees, debates, procedures, and traditions. When everyone is responsible, no one truly is. This creates a dangerous calm. Crises lose their emotional weight as they move through layers of discussion. By the time a threat reaches the floor, it has already been softened by language, reclassified as manageable, and framed as familiar. The Senate was not indifferent, it was insulated. Status played a crucial role. Senators were men who had survived long careers by avoiding extremes. They learned that survival in politics meant patience, alignment, and careful positioning. Radical action was associated with tyrants and demagogues, not statesmen. The worst accusation in Roman political culture was not incompetence, but recklessness. And so senators learned to speak cautiously, to frame danger as distant, to recommend observation rather than intervention. Psychological safety came from blending in, not standing out. There was also the weight of legacy. Senators were conscious of history watching them. Every decision would be judged by ancestors and descendants alike. This produced a paralyzing reverence for tradition. Innovation felt like betrayal. To change course too abruptly risked dishonoring the past. The Senate trusted that what had built Rome must continue to protect it. This faith in continuity became emotional, almost spiritual. Questioning it felt disloyal. Perhaps most importantly, the Senate feared loss of control more than loss itself. Sudden action introduces unpredictability. Unpredictability threatens hierarchy. The Senate preferred slow decline to sudden disruption because slow decline preserved structure. Even as danger grew, the rituals of governance continued. Meetings were held. Votes were taken. Procedures were followed. This created the illusion of control. The system appeared functional even as its effectiveness eroded. The Senate mistook order for safety. In the end, the psychology of the Senate was not irrational. It was human, scaled up to an institution. It valued stability, reputation, and cohesion. But those values, once adaptive, became liabilities in moments of rapid change. The Senate did not fail because it misunderstood the world. It failed because it understood itself too well and chose self-preservation over transformation. When Caesar came. When Caesar emerged, the Senate did not see a revolution. It saw a career. That distinction changed everything. Julius Caesar did not arrive as an enemy of the Republic. He arrived as its product. He spoke its language, respected its rituals, and operated within its legal gray zones. This made him far more dangerous than an outsider. To the Senate, Caesar was not a sudden threat, but a familiar figure rising step by step through accepted pathways. Each move he made could be explained, justified, normalized, and because no single action appeared fatal, the accumulation of power went unchallenged. The Senate had seen ambitious men before. Generals with loyal armies were not new. Popular leaders were not unprecedented. Emergency powers had been granted in crises many times. Caesar's rise fit comfortably into existing patterns, and that was precisely the problem. The Senate evaluated him using old templates, assuming that ambition would eventually be balanced by tradition, law, or rivals. They believed the system would correct itself, as it always had. What they failed to understand was that Caesar was not exploiting a weakness. He was revealing one. The Republic depended on restraint, but restraint only works when ambition respects limits. Caesar did not. As Caesar gained military success and public support, the Senate hesitated. To confront him early would require unity and resolve, neither of which existed. Some senators feared his power. Others benefited from it. Many hoped to use him against their rivals. This fragmentation paralyzed response. Caesar was debated endlessly, but never decisively. Every proposal to limit him was softened, delayed, or blocked. Extraordinary commands were extended. Deadlines were postponed. Each concession was framed as temporary, but temporary measures, when repeated, become permanent realities. The critical moment came when Caesar stood at the edge of legality. By then, the Senate had already surrendered initiative. Crossing the Rubicon was not the beginning of the crisis. It was its confirmation. The real failure occurred earlier, when the Senate treated systemic erosion as manageable politics. By the time Caesar forced the issue, the Senate's options had narrowed to extremes: submission or violence. There was no longer space for reform, only reaction. The assassination of Julius Caesar revealed the depth of misunderstanding. The Senate believed removing the man would restore the system. It did not grasp that the system itself had already changed. Power had shifted from institution to individual long before the blades were drawn. Caesar was not the cause of the Republic's collapse. He was its symptom. Killing him addressed the symbol, not the structure. What the Senate failed to recognize was timing. Authority erodes gradually, but it must be defended early or not at all. By waiting for certainty, the Senate allowed momentum to build against it. By prioritizing procedure over power, it lost both. Caesar succeeded not because he was uniquely brilliant, but because he acted while others deliberated. He moved forward while the Senate looked backward. And when the Senate finally woke up, it discovered that legality without force and tradition without adaptability could no longer protect it. Caesar came quietly, wrapped in legitimacy, applauded by the crowd, tolerated by his peers, and when he finally stood unmistakably against the Republic, the Senate realized too late that it had been negotiating with the end of its own authority. Late-waking empires. Rome was not unique. It only feels unique because it was documented so thoroughly. History is filled with empires that did not collapse suddenly, but slowly, while still believing they were strong. These empires did not fall because they lacked power. They fell because they misunderstood time. They assumed that strength decays loudly, that danger announces itself clearly, that decline looks like chaos. In reality, decline often looks like routine. Meetings continue, titles remain, armies exist on paper, laws are enforced, life appears normal, and that normality becomes the trap. Late-waking empires share the same illusion, that endurance equals immunity. Long survival creates psychological armor. The longer a system lasts, the more it believes that survival itself is proof of correctness. Every past crisis becomes evidence that the future will also be manageable. Warning signs are interpreted as temporary stress, not structural failure. Leaders do not deny problems outright, they downscale them. They say reforms can wait, that the system needs adjustment, not transformation, that tomorrow will be clearer than today, and tomorrow always arrives too late. These empires confuse control with stability. As long as borders are defended, taxes collected, and rituals maintained, they believe order exists. But order is not the same as resilience. Resilience requires the ability to change direction under pressure. Late-waking empires resist that ability because change threatens identity. To adapt too much is to admit that the past is no longer sufficient. And for empires built on memory, that admission is intolerable. Another shared trait is the fear of internal disruption. As empires age, they fear fracture more than invasion. Civil conflict, loss of legitimacy, and elite rivalry haunt them. As a result, leaders prioritize unity over accuracy. They avoid decisive action that might divide factions. Delay becomes a strategy to preserve cohesion, but this strategy quietly hands initiative to external forces and internal decay alike. By the time unity is achieved, the moment for effective action has passed. Late-waking empires also suffer from symbolic blindness. They focus on maintaining appearances rather than addressing realities. Grand architecture, ceremonies, titles, and language continue unchanged, creating the illusion that power still functions as it always has. But symbolism without adaptability becomes hollow. Empires begin to govern memory instead of circumstances. They speak in inherited language to describe a world that no longer fits those words. Perhaps the most tragic pattern is that late-waking empires often recognize danger only after it becomes irreversible. The realization is sharp, sudden, and painful. But recognition without capacity is useless. When reform is attempted too late, it destabilizes rather than saves. Emergency measures expose weakness instead of resolving it. What could have been gradual adaptation becomes violent collapse. History does not punish empires for being evil or arrogant. It punishes them for being slow. The true enemy is not external pressure, but delayed understanding. Rome, like many before and after it, believed it had time. And time, misunderstood, became the weapon that defeated it. Late-waking empires fall not because they are attacked, but because they wake up to find that the world has already moved on without them. Philosophical conclusion. Rome did not collapse because it lacked intelligence, experience, or moral awareness. It collapsed because it confused continuity with wisdom. The Roman Senate believed that thinking carefully was the same as thinking correctly. that preserving order was the same as preserving life. But philosophy teaches a harder truth. Reason without action becomes ritual, and memory without adaptation becomes weight. Rome's tragedy was not ignorance, but attachment. Attachment to what had worked, to what had endured, to what had once been true. Power shapes perception. When a system governs for too long, it begins to see the world not as it is, but as it must be for the system to remain legitimate. Reality becomes negotiable. Warnings become opinions. Change becomes disturbance. In such systems, the highest virtue is no longer truth, but stability. And stability, when elevated above all else, becomes the enemy of survival. Rome chose order over responsiveness, dignity over urgency, and consistency over transformation. These were not irrational choices, they were human ones. But history does not reward human comfort, it rewards alignment with reality. The deepest philosophical lesson of Rome is this: decline does not announce itself as decline. It arrives disguised as normality. It speaks in familiar language. It respects tradition. It follows procedure. And because it feels safe, it is trusted. The Senate mistook the absence of panic for the presence of control. It believed that as long as institutions functioned, the state itself must be secure. But functioning is not the same as thriving. A system can operate perfectly while moving in the wrong direction. Another lesson is the danger of delayed responsibility. The Senate believed that waiting preserved options. In reality, waiting erased them. Every moment of indecision narrowed the future. Philosophy reminds us that inaction is not neutrality, it is participation in the outcome. By choosing not to choose, Rome still chose. It chose the path of least disruption, and that path led quietly toward collapse. Perhaps the most uncomfortable conclusion is how familiar this pattern is. Rome is not a distant anomaly, it is a mirror. Any system that values its own preservation above truth will eventually fail to recognize when preservation requires change. Any authority that fears disruption more than decay will awaken too late. The Roman Senate was not corrupted by evil intentions, but by self-protective rationality. It reasoned itself into irrelevance. In the end, Rome teaches that the greatest danger is not the external enemy, but the internal belief that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Philosophy does not ask us to abandon tradition, but to question when tradition stops serving life. Rome could not ask that question in time, and history, indifferent and patient, answered it for them. Are we waking up too late? This question is uncomfortable, precisely because it does not belong to the past. Rome is not a warning frozen in history. It is a pattern that repeats wherever systems grow, confident enough to mistake stability for permanence. We, like the Roman Senate, are surrounded by information. Warnings are everywhere. Reports, data, forecasts, expert analyses, visible cracks in social, political, and ecological structures. Nothing is hidden, and yet action lags behind awareness. We know more than any society before us, but we hesitate just as long. The problem is not lack of knowledge. It is the cost of accepting what knowledge implies. Just as in Rome, admitting danger today carries consequences. It means acknowledging that familiar systems may no longer be sufficient, that progress may have created fragility, that comfort may be unsustainable, and these admissions threaten identity. Institutions, governments, corporations, even individuals resist such realizations because they demand change, sacrifice, and uncertainty. It feels safer to debate, to postpone, to wait for clearer signs. But clearer signs usually appear only after damage becomes undeniable. Modern societies share the same psychological defenses as ancient ones. We normalize warnings by repetition. We call crises temporary. We compare them to past scares that did not end in catastrophe. We trust that technology, markets, or future reforms will resolve what present courage avoids. Like Rome, we rely on systems designed for stability to solve problems created by acceleration. And when those systems struggle, we respond not by transforming them, but by defending them more fiercely. The most dangerous belief we share with Rome is the belief that there is still time. Time feels abundant when daily life continues, when routines remain intact, when collapse has not yet disrupted normality. But history shows that the moment when everything still works is often the moment of greatest vulnerability. By the time disruption is undeniable, adaptation becomes far more painful and far less effective. This is not a call to panic, but to awareness of how delay operates. Rome did not fall because its leaders were malicious or foolish. They fell because they acted rationally within a framework that no longer matched reality. We risk the same fate when we prioritize comfort over responsiveness, cohesion over honesty, and procedure over courage. The lesson of Rome is not that collapse is inevitable, but that awakening must come before certainty. Systems that wait to be proven wrong are usually proven too late. The question then is not whether we face dangers, it is whether we are willing to recognize that awareness without action is its own form of blindness. Rome woke up when it no longer mattered. History will judge us not by what we knew, but by when we chose to act. Why were the warners silenced? Those who warn early are rarely welcomed. In Rome, as in many systems before and after it, early warning was not treated as responsibility. It was treated as disruption. The problem was not that the Senate did not hear the warnings. It was that it heard them too soon, and timing in politics is everything. A warning delivered before consensus feels premature. A warning delivered before visible damage feels exaggerated, and a warning delivered before permission feels dangerous. In the Roman Senate, to warn was to accuse, not openly, but implicitly. Every warning suggested that someone had failed, that the system was unprepared, that authority had misjudged reality. This made warnings politically toxic. They did not simply describe a threat, they threatened reputations. Senators who spoke too clearly risked being seen not as protectors of Rome, but as critics of Rome's leadership. And criticism, even when accurate, was interpreted as ambition or disloyalty. There was also a deep fear of panic. The Senate believed that stability depended on calm, and calm depended on controlling narrative. Early warnings disrupted that control. They introduced uncertainty before the system had decided how to frame it. In Roman political culture, order was moral. Panic was seen not as a reaction to danger, but as a failure of discipline. Those who warned too forcefully were accused of undermining confidence, weakening morale, or stirring fear among the people. Silence, in contrast, was framed as responsibility. Another reason warners were silenced was that truth arrives asymmetrically. The first people to notice danger are often isolated. They see fragments before patterns are widely visible. Institutions, however, trust collective recognition over individual insight. A single voice is easy to dismiss. 10 voices are debatable. 100 voices become undeniable. But by then, the moment for prevention has passed. Rome waited for agreement, not accuracy, and agreement always arrives late. Warnings also threatened hierarchy. Roman politics was deeply status-driven. Authority flowed from rank, age, and lineage, not from insight. When a lower status figure warned higher authorities, the message was often rejected, not because it was wrong, but because of who delivered it. To accept the warning would invert the hierarchy, granting legitimacy to someone outside the established order. Institutions instinctively resist such inversions. It feels safer to dismiss the message than to elevate the messenger. Perhaps most dangerously, early warnings lacked proof. They relied on projection, interpretation, and imagination. Institutions distrust imagination. They prefer evidence that can be counted, verified, and archived. But existential threats rarely announce themselves with certainty. They appear as trends, shifts, weak signals. Those who speak about them must rely on judgment rather than data. In Rome, this made warners vulnerable. Without undeniable proof, their claims could be reframed as speculation, and speculation in political language is easily neutralized. Over time, a culture of silence formed. Senators learned that caution was rewarded and urgency punished. Speaking too early carried social and political costs, while waiting carried none, at least initially. This created a perverse incentive structure. The system trained its members not to see clearly, but to speak safely. Truth became something to be shared quietly, privately, too late. Publicly, the acceptable posture was restraint. History shows that this pattern is not accidental. Systems silence early warners because early warning threatens the illusion of control. It forces confrontation with uncertainty, responsibility, and change. And change is always more frightening than danger itself. Rome did not silence its warners because it hated truth. It silenced them because truth arrived before the system was emotionally ready to accept it. By the time warnings became popular, they were no longer warnings. They were confirmations. And confirmations do not save systems, they explain why they failed. The invisible gap between the Senate and the people. The Roman Senate believed it governed Rome, but in reality it governed an idea of Rome, one that increasingly diverged from the lives of ordinary people. This gap was not sudden and it was not intentional. It formed slowly through distance, insulation, and privilege. Senators lived in a different Rome. Their city was made of marble halls, inherited estates, political alliances, and controlled debates. The people lived in a Rome of rising prices, military conscription, unstable grain supplies, and daily uncertainty. Both groups spoke of the same republic, but they experienced entirely different realities. The Senate received information through reports, summaries, and intermediaries. The people experienced reality directly. Hunger did not arrive as a document. Fear was not a discussion point. Economic pressure was not theoretical. But when lived experience passed upward through the system, it was filtered, softened, and translated into administrative language. Urgency lost its emotional force. Suffering became data. By the time the Senate debated popular discontent, that discontent had already hardened into resentment. This created a dangerous misunderstanding. The Senate assumed silence meant stability. As long as the streets were not in open revolt, the system was considered functional. But silence among the people was not consent. It was endurance. The lower classes had learned that speaking carried risk and rarely produced change. Their quiet was interpreted as acceptance, when in fact it was exhaustion. The Senate mistook patience for loyalty. Elites often believe they represent the people simply by speaking on their behalf. But representation without proximity becomes abstraction. Senators debated what the people needed without living among them. They discussed reforms without feeling consequences. Over time, this created a moral disconnect. Policies were judged by elegance and legality, not by impact. The Senate believed it was being rational, while the people felt ignored. This gap also distorted threat perception. When the people sensed danger, economic collapse, social instability, loss of trust, they reacted emotionally and early. The Senate reacted intellectually and late. Emotion was dismissed as irrational. Fear was labeled exaggeration. But fear is often the first indicator of structural stress. By rejecting the emotional signals of the population, the Senate blinded itself to early warnings that no report could capture. Populist figures understood this gap instinctively. They spoke directly to lived experience rather than institutional logic. This terrified the Senate, not because populists were always wrong, but because they bypassed the Senate's control over narrative. When the people listened elsewhere, the Senate felt its authority eroding. Instead of closing the gap, it tried to suppress its visibility. The result was deeper alienation. The tragedy is that the Senate believed it was protecting Rome from chaos, while the people increasingly felt Rome was no longer protecting them. This mutual misunderstanding weakened both sides. Trust dissolved quietly. By the time conflict became visible, it was already embedded. Empires do not collapse only when institutions fail. They collapse when institutions and people stop sharing the same reality. Rome reached that point long before it fell. The Senate spoke of order. The people felt disorder, and between those two perceptions, an invisible gap widened, one that no law, debate, or tradition could bridge once it was ignored for too long. When laws function, but justice stops. One of the most dangerous moments in the life of a system is not when laws are broken, but when laws function perfectly while justice quietly disappears. In Rome, legality survived long after legitimacy began to erode. Procedures were followed, votes were taken, offices were filled according to tradition. From the outside, the Republic looked orderly, but order is not the same as fairness, and legality is not the same as justice. The Senate relied on law as proof that the system was still healthy, even as the moral substance beneath those laws hollowed out. Roman law was sophisticated, precise, and deeply respected. That precision became a shield. As long as actions could be justified legally, their consequences were treated as acceptable. Decisions that harmed large portions of the population were defended with technical correctness. Exploitation became lawful. Inequality became procedural. Suffering became compliant with regulations. This created a chilling inversion. Injustice was no longer seen as injustice if it followed the rules. The law did not restrain power, it legitimized it. The Senate increasingly confused moral responsibility with legal compliance. Senators asked not whether a decision was right, but whether it was permitted. Once legality replaced conscience, accountability faded. The law became a language for avoiding responsibility rather than assuming it. When confronted with the harm their decisions caused, senators pointed to statutes, precedents, and procedures. The system spoke for them. And because the system was abstract, no one could be held personally responsible. This legalism also slowed response to crisis. Justice often demands speed, flexibility, and moral clarity. Law demands process, verification, and restraint. In stable times, this balance works. In times of crisis, it becomes fatal. Rome faced rapidly changing conditions: economic stress, military threats, social fragmentation, but responded with mechanisms designed for slow, predictable environments. By the time legal authorization was secured, the moment for justice had passed. The law arrived on time. Justice arrived too late. For the people, this distinction mattered deeply. They did not experience oppression as illegal. They experienced it as unavoidable. When they appealed to authority, they were answered with regulations rather than relief. The message was clear. The system was functioning, therefore their suffering must be acceptable. This destroyed trust. A society can tolerate hardship, but it cannot tolerate the feeling that hardship is invisible. When law ceases to reflect lived reality, it becomes alien. Perhaps the most corrosive effect was how legality normalized inequality. Powerful actors learned to operate within the law while bending outcomes in their favor. The poor and powerless experienced the law not as protection, but as distance. Justice became something theoretical, something spoken about in the Senate but absent in the streets. The more perfectly the law functioned, the less people believed in its fairness. Rome teaches a brutal lesson. Systems do not collapse when laws stop working. They collapse when laws work too well for the wrong people. When legality becomes a substitute for morality, decline accelerates under the appearance of order. The Senate believed that as long as the law stood, Rome stood. But justice is not sustained by procedure alone. When justice stops, laws continue, but they continue for themselves, not for the people they were meant to serve. How Rome turned its own power into a weapon. Rome did not lose power before it fell. It lost direction. Strength remained visible long after wisdom began to fade. The legions still marched. The laws still functioned. The symbols of authority still inspired fear and obedience. But power, when no longer guided by clarity, does not protect a system. It hardens it. Rome's greatest weapon was not its army or its laws. It was its belief in its own inevitability. And that belief slowly turned inward. At first, Roman power was adaptive. Expansion demanded flexibility, negotiation, and learning from enemies. Rome absorbed tactics, cultures, and institutions from those it conquered. Power was a tool for survival. But as Rome grew, survival became assumed. Power stopped being questioned. It became identity. Rome no longer asked whether its strength served the Republic. It assumed the Republic existed to preserve strength. This inversion changed everything. Power began to silence doubt. When a system is strong, criticism feels unnecessary. Warning feels disloyal. Hesitation feels like weakness. Rome's dominance created a psychological shield against self-examination. Because Rome had overcome so many threats, it believed that future threats must be manageable. This made power dangerous. It transformed confidence into arrogance and caution into denial. Strength stopped listening. Rome also turned power into a weapon against adaptation. Institutions designed to defend the Republic began defending themselves instead. Military success justified political rigidity. Economic dominance excused inequality. Legal authority legitimized delay. Every display of strength reduced the perceived need for change. Power became a reason to remain the same. The stronger Rome appeared, the less urgency it felt to evolve. Internally, power was used to suppress instability rather than resolve its causes. Dissent was framed as threat. Reform was treated as disruption. The Senate feared internal fracture more than external defeat. As a result, Rome applied its strength inward, enforcing order without addressing decay. This created the illusion of control, while accelerating erosion beneath the surface. Power kept the structure standing, even as the foundation weakened. Externally, Rome relied on intimidation long after persuasion would have been wiser. Dominance replaced diplomacy. Fear replaced loyalty. Allies obeyed, but no longer believed. And when power is maintained through pressure rather than trust, it must be constantly applied. This exhausts the system. Power becomes expensive. Each act of enforcement requires more force than the last. Rome became trapped in its own strength. Perhaps the most destructive transformation was how power altered Rome's relationship with time. Strength created patience where urgency was needed. Rome believed it could afford delay because it could absorb shocks. But power does not stop change. It only delays its consequences. By the time power could no longer compensate for structural weakness, collapse was sudden and violent. Rome did not fall because it became weak. It fell because it weaponized its strength against reality. Power, once a means of survival, became a substitute for understanding. And when power replaces reflection, it turns from shield to blade, cutting inward, dulling judgment, and ultimately striking the system that wields it. Why is danger always called tomorrow? Danger is rarely denied outright. It is postponed. In Rome, as in every complex system, threats were not rejected, they were scheduled. They were placed safely in the future, away from the discomfort of immediate responsibility. Calling danger tomorrow was not ignorance. It was strategy, a psychological maneuver that allowed leaders to acknowledge risk without paying the cost of action. Tomorrow sounds reasonable. Tomorrow feels controlled. Tomorrow implies time, options, and preparation. But tomorrow, repeated often enough, becomes a trap. The human mind is built to prioritize the present. Immediate stability feels more real than distant catastrophe. For the Roman Senate, acting now meant disruption, political conflict, social unrest, personal risk. Waiting promised comfort. As long as danger had not yet arrived, it could be debated, measured, reframed. By labeling threats as future problems, the Senate protected itself from the anxiety of decisive action. Delay became a form of emotional regulation. Institutions amplify this tendency. Collective decision-making dilutes urgency. When responsibility is shared, action feels less personal. Each member waits for others to move first. Tomorrow becomes the compromise between awareness and courage. It allows leaders to appear responsible without committing. In Rome, this produced endless observation without intervention. Threats were acknowledged but not confronted. The Senate mistook discussion for progress. There is also the illusion of reversibility. Tomorrow suggests that choices remain open. Acting today feels final. It closes paths, creates enemies, sets precedents. Waiting preserves flexibility, or so it seems. In reality, delay narrows options. Circumstances evolve independently of decisions. By the time tomorrow arrives, the conditions that made action effective may have vanished. The Senate believed time was neutral. It was not. Time always favors momentum. Another reason danger is postponed is fear of being wrong. Acting early carries reputational risk. If the threat does not materialize, the decision appears foolish. Waiting allows leaders to claim prudence. In Roman political culture, restraint was rewarded more than foresight. Those who warned early were criticized if events unfolded slowly. Those who acted late were forgiven because everyone acted late together. Collective failure feels safer than individual courage. Perhaps most importantly, calling danger tomorrow preserves identity. It allows systems to remain unchanged today. Accepting immediate danger would require admitting that existing structures are insufficient. That past success no longer guarantees future security. For Rome, this was intolerable. The Senate's authority rested on continuity. Tomorrow allowed continuity to survive one more day. History reveals the cost of this habit. The most expensive word in politics is later. Danger rarely arrives suddenly. It accumulates quietly while attention drifts. By the time tomorrow becomes today, response becomes reaction. Prevention becomes survival. Rome did not lose because it failed to see danger. It lost because it kept moving danger just far enough away to avoid acting, until distance turned into destiny. The Senate's most feared enemy, panic. For the Roman Senate, panic was more frightening than defeat. Armies could be rebuilt, cities could be retaken, losses could be explained. Panic, however, could not be controlled once released. It moved faster than legions, ignored hierarchy, and dissolved authority in ways no external enemy ever could. To the Senate, panic was not an emotion. It was a political force capable of undoing everything order had built. And so, above all else, panic had to be prevented. The Senate believed that power depended on calm. As long as Rome appeared composed, disciplined, and rational, authority would hold. Panic threatened that image. It exposed fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability, things the Senate believed must never be visible. Acknowledging danger too openly risked shaking public confidence. It risked revealing that the guardians of the state were unsure, and uncertainty at the top was seen as an invitation to chaos below. This fear shaped every response to crisis. Threats were minimized, language was softened, urgent warnings were reframed as manageable challenges, not because the Senate did not understand the danger, but because it feared the consequences of admitting it. Panic, in their view, did not merely react to danger, it created danger. It could spark unrest, empower demagogues, weaken morale, and fracture unity. Better to delay action than to provoke fear. Better to control the narrative than to confront reality. But this logic carried a fatal flaw. Panic suppressed does not disappear, it accumulates. When people sense that information is being withheld or softened, trust erodes. Silence breeds rumor. Reassurance breeds suspicion. The Senate believed it was protecting Rome from panic, but in doing so, it trained the population to stop believing official calm. When fear finally surfaced, it did so uncontrollably, precisely because it had been denied expression for so long. The Senate also feared panic internally. Among senators, panic meant loss of composure, rushed decisions, and visible disagreement. Calm debate was the symbol of Roman superiority, proof that Rome ruled itself through reason rather than impulse. To panic was to behave like barbarians, not statesmen. This cultural ideal made emotional responses suspect. Fear was treated as weakness, urgency as instability, and so even when the situation demanded speed, the Senate chose slowness to preserve dignity. Ironically, this obsession with avoiding panic created a deeper one. When crises finally broke through denial, when defeats were undeniable, when authority cracked, the reaction was extreme. Years of restraint collapsed into sudden, violent measures, emergency powers, executions, civil war. The panic the Senate feared most arrived not because danger was acknowledged too early, but because it was acknowledged too late. History shows that panic is not the enemy of survival. Unmanaged denial is. Panic can prompt action, adaptation, and unity if addressed honestly. But systems that fear panic more than reality lose the ability to respond proportionally. Rome tried to govern fear instead of confronting its cause. In doing so, it allowed fear to grow in silence. The Senate's greatest mistake was believing that calm could replace courage. Panic was treated as something to suppress, rather than something to listen to. And when fear is silenced long enough, it returns not as warning, but as collapse. Why Rome trusted tradition over experience. Rome did not lack experience. It possessed centuries of victories, failures, reforms, and recoveries. No state of its time knew war, politics, and power better. And yet, when faced with new realities, Rome chose tradition over lived experience. This was not ignorance, it was loyalty. Tradition was Rome's identity, and identity is more powerful than evidence. Tradition offered certainty. Experience offered ambiguity. Experience changes with circumstances. Tradition promises continuity. For the Roman Senate, tradition was not simply custom, it was legitimacy. Authority flowed from ancestors, rituals, and inherited practices. To question tradition was to question the moral right to rule. Experience could suggest that something no longer worked, but tradition insisted that it must continue working because it always had, and always carried more weight than now. Experience is disruptive. It forces reassessment. It demands adaptation. Tradition is comforting. It reduces uncertainty by providing fixed answers. In moments of stress, Rome retreated into the familiar. Instead of asking what the present required, the Senate asked what the past permitted. This made tradition a filter through which experience was interpreted. New evidence was accepted only if it fit old frameworks. If it did not, it was dismissed as anomaly. There was also fear embedded in tradition. Roman history was marked by civil war, tyranny, and internal collapse. Traditions had emerged as safeguards against chaos. They were seen as barriers protecting the Republic from itself. Changing them felt dangerous. Even when experience suggested reform, tradition warned of instability. The Senate believed it was safer to endure inefficiency than to risk transformation. Tradition also protected hierarchy. It preserved status, privilege, and power distribution. Experience does not respect rank. It exposes reality regardless of position. Tradition, however, reinforces who gets to decide. By privileging tradition over experience, the Senate protected not only the system, but its own place within it. Adaptation threatened to elevate new voices and diminish old ones. Resistance to change was therefore both ideological and personal. Perhaps most importantly, tradition slowed moral responsibility. Experience often produces urgent ethical demands. Tradition absorbs those demands into ritual. It turns questions into procedures. This allowed Rome to feel morally grounded while avoiding difficult choices. The Senate could claim virtue through continuity, even as conditions deteriorated. Rome's tragedy was not that it honored tradition, but that it mistook tradition for truth. Experience was treated as noise unless it echoed the past. When reality finally broke through tradition's defenses, it did so violently. Rome did not fail because it forgot its history. It failed because it allowed history to replace perception. Tradition can preserve a system, but only when it remains responsive to experience. When tradition becomes an end in itself, it ceases to guide and begins to blind. Rome trusted tradition to protect it. Instead, tradition protected the past, while the future slipped away. What an empire looks like as it collapses from within. An empire does not announce its collapse. It performs it quietly while appearing intact. From the outside, everything still seems to function. Borders exist. Laws are enforced. Officials hold titles. The symbols of power remain impressive. Collapse from within is not a visible event. It is a process of erosion hidden behind routine. The most dangerous phase is when the empire still looks strong enough to deny its own weakness. The first sign is not chaos, but repetition. The same solutions are applied to new problems regardless of context. Language becomes stale. Leaders repeat familiar phrases while reality shifts beneath them. Innovation is treated as disruption, not necessity. Experience is filtered through tradition until it loses relevance. The empire stops learning and begins remembering. The second sign is institutional fatigue. Structures remain, but purpose fades. Offices are filled, yet decisions lack conviction. Responsibility becomes symbolic rather than real. Rules are followed without understanding why. Governance turns into maintenance. The system is no longer steering, it is drifting while preserving form. Next comes the separation between appearance and substance. Success is measured by optics rather than outcomes. Ceremonies replace solutions. Public statements emphasize stability, while private confidence erodes. Leaders speak of continuity while quietly managing decline. The empire becomes expert at appearing functional while losing effectiveness. Another key sign is the moral hollowing of authority. Laws continue, but justice becomes selective. Power protects itself rather than the population. Inequality becomes normalized. Those at the center feel insulated, while those at the margins feel abandoned. Trust erodes silently. People comply not because they believe, but because resistance feels futile. Fear of change intensifies. Reform is postponed. Radical ideas are labeled dangerous. Stability becomes sacred, even as it no longer delivers security. The empire chooses predictability over adaptability. In doing so, it sacrifices resilience. When systems prioritize self-preservation over renewal, they lose the ability to respond to shocks. Finally, collapse becomes visible only when it is irreversible. Internal fractures surface as crises. Authority suddenly weakens. Measures taken too late accelerate breakdown rather than prevent it. What appears to be sudden collapse is actually delayed recognition. Empires that fall from within do not die screaming. They fade behind protocol, tradition, and order. They collapse not from attack, but from exhaustion. And by the time collapse becomes obvious, the empire has already been gone for a long time. Rome was not ready for the truth. Rome did not reject truth because it was false. It rejected it because it was inconvenient. Truth demanded change, and change threatened everything Rome believed made it strong. The Senate did not fear lies. It feared what truth would require. To accept the truth meant admitting that the world Rome had mastered was no longer the world it ruled, that its tools were outdated, that its confidence was misplaced, and those admissions carried a cost far greater than denial. Truth arrives early before consensus, before proof becomes undeniable. It speaks in patterns, warnings, and discomfort. Rome was structured to respond to certainty, not to possibility. The Senate trusted evidence only when it was complete, measurable, and safe to acknowledge. But by the time truth becomes comfortable, it is no longer useful. Rome waited for clarity, and clarity arrived as consequence. There was also pride. Rome believed in itself as a civilizing force, a rational order superior to chaos. Truth that challenged this self-image felt like betrayal. It suggested that Rome could be wrong, not temporarily, but fundamentally. Institutions built on superiority struggle to hear such truths. They prefer explanations that preserve identity. Rome reinterpreted truth to fit its narrative rather than adjusting the narrative to fit truth. Power further distorted perception. Those closest to authority are often farthest from reality. Comfort creates distance. Reports are filtered. Language is softened. Disruption is reframed as manageable. By the time truth reached the Senate, it had been stripped of urgency. Rome did not lack information, it lacked exposure. It saw truth abstractly, not experientially. Truth also threatened stability. Accepting it would force immediate action, provoke unrest, empower critics, and weaken the appearance of control. The Senate chose silence over shock. It believed that maintaining calm was more important than confronting reality. But calm built on denial is fragile. When truth finally breaks through, it does so violently. Perhaps most tragically, Rome confused truth with blame. To accept truth meant admitting responsibility. It meant acknowledging that failure was not external, but internal. This made truth politically dangerous. Safer to delay, safer to debate, safer to wait until truth could no longer be denied, when denial no longer mattered. Rome was not destroyed by ignorance. It was undone by its inability to accept uncomfortable reality in time. Truth stood at the door long before collapse. Rome heard it knock, but it was not ready to answer. The final philosophical question. There is a moment in the life of every system that history does not mark with dates or battles. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly, a moment when survival is no longer about renewal, but about defense, when the goal shifts from solving problems to preserving appearance. That moment is not collapse, but it is the point of no return. A system saves itself when it is willing to change. It protects itself when it is no longer willing to question its own foundations. The difference is subtle but decisive. Self-preservation feels responsible. It promises stability, continuity, control. But beneath that promise lies fear. Fear of disruption, fear of loss, fear of admitting that what once worked no longer does. When a system chooses protection over transformation, it trades future survival for present comfort. At that point, the system still functions, Laws still operate, offices still exist, language still sounds confident. From the outside, nothing appears broken, but internally, movement has stopped. Energy flows not toward adaptation, but toward containment. Problems are managed, not resolved. Truth is delayed, not confronted. The system becomes very good at staying the same and very bad at staying alive. This is the most dangerous phase because it feels like wisdom. Caution is praised. Restraint is rewarded. Those who push for change are framed as threats. Stability becomes a moral virtue, even as reality shifts beyond recognition. The system does not realize it is dying because death does not look like failure. It looks like order without meaning. So is the system already finished at that point? Not technically. It may endure for years, even decades, but philosophically it has ended. Its purpose has inverted. What once existed to serve life now exists to preserve itself. And systems that exist only for themselves no longer evolve, they decay. History suggests a harsh answer. A system can survive mistakes, defeats, and even corruption. But once it chooses self-protection over self-correction, its fate is sealed. Collapse may be slow, quiet, postponed, but direction has already been set. The final question then is not about Rome. It is about us, about any institution, society, or belief that fears change more than irrelevance. The moment self-preservation replaces self-examination is the moment history begins to write the ending. Long before anyone realizes the story is over. Are we waking up too late? This question is uncomfortable, precisely because it does not belong to the past. Rome is not a warning frozen in history. It is a pattern that repeats wherever systems grow, confident enough to mistake stability for permanence. We, like the Roman Senate, are surrounded by information. Warnings are everywhere. Reports, data, forecasts, expert analyses, visible cracks in social, political, and ecological structures. Nothing is hidden, and yet action lags behind awareness. We know more than any society before us, but we hesitate just as long. The problem is not lack of knowledge. It is the cost of accepting what knowledge implies. Just as in Rome, admitting danger today carries consequences. It means acknowledging that familiar systems may no longer be sufficient, that progress may have created fragility, that comfort may be unsustainable, and these admissions threaten identity. Institutions, governments, corporations, even individuals resist such realizations because they demand change, sacrifice, and uncertainty. It feels safer to debate, to postpone, to wait for clearer signs. But clearer signs usually appear only after damage becomes undeniable. Modern societies share the same psychological defenses as ancient ones. We normalize warnings by repetition. We call crises temporary. We compare them to past scares that did not end in catastrophe. We trust that technology, markets, or future reforms will resolve what present courage avoids. Like Rome, we rely on systems designed for stability to solve problems created by acceleration. And when those systems struggle, we respond not by transforming them, but by defending them more fiercely. The most dangerous belief we share with Rome is the belief that there is still time. Time feels abundant when daily life continues, when routines remain intact, when collapse has not yet disrupted normality. But history shows that the moment when everything still works is often the moment of greatest vulnerability. By the time disruption is undeniable, adaptation becomes far more painful and far less effective. This is not a call to panic, but to awareness of how delay operates. Rome did not fall because its leaders were malicious or foolish. They fell because they acted rationally within a framework that no longer matched reality. We risk the same fate when we prioritize comfort over responsiveness, cohesion over honesty, and procedure over courage. The lesson of Rome is not that collapse is inevitable, but that awakening must come before certainty. Systems that wait to be proven wrong are usually proven too late. The question then is not whether we face dangers, it is whether we are willing to recognize that awareness without action is its own form of blindness. Rome woke up when it no longer mattered. History will judge us not by what we knew, but by when we chose to act. The psychology of the Senate. The Roman Senate did not think like an individual. It thought like an institution, and that difference mattered. Institutions are not driven by fear or instinct. They are driven by preservation. Every decision the Senate made passed through an invisible filter. What protects the system itself? This is why the Senate's psychology was fundamentally conservative, not in ideology, but in function. Its first reflex was not to solve problems, but to maintain legitimacy, balance, and continuity. Speed was suspicious. Decisiveness was dangerous. Acting too early carried more political risk than acting too late. In the Senate's mind, delay was not failure, it was safety. Admitting a threat was never a neutral act. To acknowledge danger meant acknowledging vulnerability, and vulnerability threatened authority. A senator who warned too loudly risked being seen as irresponsible, ambitious, or destabilizing. Rome feared internal disruption more than external enemies. Civil conflict had scarred the Republic deeply, and the memory of internal collapse shaped every reaction. As a result, unity became more important than accuracy. Consensus mattered more than truth. A wrong decision made together felt safer than a correct decision made alone. This psychology rewarded silence and punished urgency. The Senate also suffered from diffusion of responsibility. No single individual carried full accountability, which meant no single individual felt compelled to act decisively. Responsibility was spread across committees, debates, procedures, and traditions. When everyone is responsible, no one truly is. This creates a dangerous calm. Crises lose their emotional weight as they move through layers of discussion. By the time a threat reaches the floor, it has already been softened by language, reclassified as manageable, and framed as familiar. The Senate was not indifferent, it was insulated. Status played a crucial role. Senators were men who had survived long careers by avoiding extremes. They learned that survival in politics meant patience, alignment, and careful positioning. Radical action was associated with tyrants and demagogues, not statesmen. The worst accusation in Roman political culture was not incompetence, but recklessness. And so senators learned to speak cautiously, to frame danger as distant, to recommend observation rather than intervention. Psychological safety came from blending in, not standing out. There was also the weight of legacy. Senators were conscious of history watching them. Every decision would be judged by ancestors and descendants alike. This produced a paralyzing reverence for tradition. Innovation felt like betrayal. To change course too abruptly risked dishonoring the past. The Senate trusted that what had built Rome must continue to protect it. This faith in continuity became emotional, almost spiritual. Questioning it felt disloyal. Perhaps most importantly, the Senate feared loss of control more than loss itself. Sudden action introduces unpredictability. Unpredictability threatens hierarchy. The Senate preferred slow decline to sudden disruption because slow decline preserved structure. Even as danger grew, the rituals of governance continued. Meetings were held. Votes were taken. Procedures were followed. This created the illusion of control. The system appeared functional even as its effectiveness eroded. The Senate mistook order for safety. In the end, the psychology of the Senate was not irrational. It was human, scaled up to an institution. It valued stability, reputation, and cohesion. But those values, once adaptive, became liabilities in moments of rapid change. The Senate did not fail because it misunderstood the world. It failed because it understood itself too well and chose self-preservation over transformation. Why did those who remained still believe? Belief does not disappear when reality collapses. It often grows stronger. The closer a system comes to the end, the more fiercely some people cling to it. This is not ignorance. It is survival psychology. When everything familiar begins to dissolve, belief becomes shelter. To abandon it would mean admitting loss, uncertainty, and fear all at once. For many in Rome, continuing to believe was easier than facing what change would demand. Those who remained believed because belief reduced pain. Accepting decline requires grief, and grief requires energy. Denial is cheaper. It allows life to continue without emotional disruption. As long as one can say, "This has happened before," or "Rome has endured worse," the present feels manageable. Belief transformed danger into background noise. It allowed people to wake up, work, and live as if tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Belief also protected identity. Rome was not just a state, it was a story people told about themselves. To stop believing in Rome was to lose oneself. Careers, honor, family status, and personal meaning were tied to the system's continuation. For the last loyalists, faith in Rome was not about truth. It was about self-preservation. Losing belief felt like erasing a lifetime. There is also the fear of isolation. When many people continue to believe, disbelief feels lonely and dangerous. Those who doubted too early risked social exclusion, political suspicion, or worse. Remaining faithful allowed individuals to stay inside the collective, even as the collective drifted toward collapse. Belief became a social bond. Questioning it threatened belonging. Another reason belief persisted was gradual decline. Rome did not fall overnight. Each loss was small enough to rationalize. Each warning was just distant enough to dismiss. Humans are poor at recognizing slow disasters. We adapt to deterioration. What would have shocked an earlier generation becomes normal to the next. The end does not feel like an end. It feels like a continuation under worse conditions. Finally, belief endured because hope is not rational. It does not follow evidence, it follows need. In moments of instability, hope fills the space where action feels impossible. Believing that Rome would recover was a way to avoid confronting powerlessness. When people cannot change outcomes, they change interpretations. Faith becomes action's replacement. History shows that those who remain loyal at the end are not fools. They are human. They cling to belief because belief delays pain. But belief, when untethered from reality, does not save systems. It only softens their fall. Rome's final believers did not preserve the empire. They preserved themselves, emotionally, socially, psychologically, until preservation was no longer possible. In the end, belief did not outlast Rome. It merely outlasted truth. Why do systems choose their strongest supporters? Systems rarely collapse because they lack talent or intelligence. They collapse because they promote the wrong qualities. When a system begins to prioritize survival over purpose, it changes what it rewards. Courage becomes risk. Honesty becomes disruption. Doubt becomes threat. In their place, systems elevate those who reinforce stability, not those who challenge decay. Strength in this context does not mean moral strength. It means loyalty, compliance, and usefulness to the existing order. As pressure increases, systems seek predictability. They favor individuals who are reliable, controllable, and aligned with institutional norms. Those who ask difficult questions introduce uncertainty. Those who follow rules reduce it. Over time, promotion becomes less about competence and more about compatibility. The system does not ask who sees clearly. It asks who will not disturb the structure. strength becomes obedience disguised as reliability. This selection process is self-reinforcing. Once the system elevates its most compliant members, decision-making narrows, feedback loops weaken, alternative perspectives disappear. The system begins to hear only echoes of itself. Dissent feels louder and more dangerous because it is no longer balanced by internal diversity. The stronger the system's grip on power, the weaker its grasp on reality. Rome exemplified this pattern. The Senate increasingly rewarded those who preserved tradition and punished those who pushed for reform. Ambition was tolerated only when it served continuity. Moral courage, when it conflicted with institutional comfort, was sidelined. Over time, this created an elite that was excellent at maintaining form and terrible at confronting change. The system became strong in appearance and fragile in substance. Systems also choose their strong supporters because fear reshapes values. Under threat, long-term thinking feels like luxury. Immediate stability becomes paramount. Individuals who promise calm, control, and reassurance are favored over those who demand uncomfortable action. The system mistakes emotional comfort for strength. This leads to a leadership culture optimized for reassurance rather than resilience. Perhaps most tragically, systems convince themselves that they are rewarding merit. Loyalty is framed as responsibility. Compliance is framed as discipline. Silence is framed as wisdom. In this way, the system moralizes its own decline. Those who conform believe they are serving the greater good, while those who resist are labeled selfish, reckless, or dangerous. In the end, systems choose their strongest supporters not because they are blind, but because they are afraid. Afraid of fragmentation, afraid of loss of control, afraid of admitting that strength itself may need to be redefined. But strength that serves preservation without renewal is not strength, it is stagnation. History shows a consistent outcome. Systems that reward obedience over insight eventually lose both. They become powerful at defending themselves and powerless at surviving change. The most dangerous moment, everything still works. The most dangerous moment in the life of a system is not when it breaks, but when it still functions. When reports are filed, meetings are held, salaries are paid, and procedures continue without interruption. Functioning creates reassurance. It convinces those inside the system that time remains, that problems are manageable, that nothing urgent is required. Everything still works becomes a lullaby, soft enough to quiet doubt, strong enough to delay action. In Rome, this illusion was lethal. The Senate looked around and saw order. Courts operated, laws were enforced, armies existed. The machinery of governance moved as it always had. From within that motion, collapse felt impossible. The assumption was simple. If the system is operating, it must be healthy. But systems can function long after they have lost direction. Motion is not purpose. Activity is not alignment. What makes this moment so dangerous is how it reframes warning. If everything still works, then those who speak of danger must be exaggerating. Urgency sounds irrational when routines remain intact. Early warnings feel premature because nothing has visibly failed. The absence of visible breakdown becomes evidence against those who sense deeper decay. Rome did not silence warning because it lacked proof. It silenced it because proof had not yet become spectacle. Functioning also delays responsibility. As long as outcomes have not collapsed, accountability can be postponed. Decisions can wait. Reforms can be studied. Committees can be formed. We are not there yet becomes the dominant logic. But not yet is a shrinking space. Every day the system continues unchanged. The cost of change increases. What could have been adjusted gradually must later be repaired violently. Another danger of everything still works is that it rewards the wrong behavior. Those who keep processes running are praised. Those who question whether the processes still make sense are seen as disruptive. Stability becomes virtue, maintenance becomes leadership. Rome elevated caretakers of form over challengers of substance. The system learned how to preserve itself, not how to correct itself. Perhaps most deceptive of all, functioning masks moral failure. Injustice can persist smoothly. Inequality can be administered efficiently. Suffering can be processed without interruption. When harm is delivered through orderly mechanisms, it appears less urgent, less visible, less scandalous. The system congratulates itself on control, while drifting further from its purpose. History teaches that collapse often begins when leaders confuse durability with legitimacy. A system can continue to operate while no longer deserving loyalty. It can perform its tasks while betraying its mission. The Roman Senate mistook continuity for correctness. By the time things stopped working, stopping was irreversible. Everything still works is not a sign of safety. It is a warning that the system has entered its most complacent phase. When nothing forces change, change is avoided. And when change is avoided long enough, the moment of failure arrives without options. Rome did not fall when its system stopped working. It fell when they worked just well enough to convince everyone that nothing had to change. How Rome normalized its own end. Rome did not accept collapse all at once. It accepted it in pieces, small enough to tolerate, familiar enough to justify. Each loss was absorbed, explained, and folded into daily life until decline no longer felt exceptional. This is how endings become normal, not through shock but through adjustment. Rome did not wake up one day and decide it was finished. It simply learned how to live with less and call it continuity. Normalization began with language. Defeats became setbacks. Crises became temporary difficulties. Structural failures were reframed as external pressures. Words softened reality until reality lost its sharpness. When a system changes how it names problems, it changes how it feels about them. Rome learned to speak about decline without calling it decline, and what is not named cannot be confronted. The next step was comparison. Every new problem was measured against worse moments in the past. We survived this before. It was harder then. History was used not as a guide, but as anesthesia. By constantly comparing the present to catastrophic memories, Rome made current deterioration feel acceptable. As long as things were not as bad as the worst remembered moment, they were considered manageable. Gradualism did the rest. Decline arrived slowly enough for adaptation to keep pace. People adjusted expectations, standards lowered quietly. What once would have caused outrage became routine. The extraordinary became ordinary. This psychological process is powerful. Humans can endure almost anything if it happens gradually. Rome did not collapse under unbearable weight. It shrank under tolerable pressure. Institutions played a central role in this normalization. They continued to function even as their purpose faded. Offices still existed. Titles were still honored. Procedures were still followed. This created the illusion that the system remained intact. Form survived longer than substance. As long as rituals continued, it felt improper to speak of endings. Collapse seemed like exaggeration when the calendar still looked normal. Normalization also protected self-respect. Admitting decline requires admitting failure. For elites especially, this was unbearable. It was easier to accept reduced influence than to accept irrelevance. Easier to manage decay than to name it. Rome's leaders did not see themselves as overseers of collapse, but as custodians of stability under difficult conditions. This self-image allowed them to function without confronting the truth. Perhaps most tragically, people normalized decline because resistance felt futile. When change appears impossible, acceptance becomes survival. Hope shifts from renewal to endurance. The goal becomes getting through the present rather than shaping the future. Rome learned how to endure its own erosion. By the time collapse became undeniable, it no longer felt shocking. It felt like the final step in a long, familiar process. Rome did not fall suddenly. It ended the way many systems do, by getting used to ending. Normalization is the quiet accomplice of decline. It does not destroy systems by force. It convinces them there is nothing left to save. Why do those who reach the truth too late punish it more harshly? Truth is most dangerous when it arrives late. Early truth can still change direction. Late truth threatens identity. When a system finally confronts reality after long denial, it does not experience relief. It experiences shame, fear, and rage. At that point, truth is no longer a guide. It is an accusation. And systems, like individuals, often respond to accusation with punishment. Those who accept truth late are forced to face what delay has cost them. Missed opportunities, preventable damage, choices not taken. This realization is psychologically unbearable. To admit that disaster could have been avoided is to admit responsibility. Instead of absorbing that responsibility, systems redirect it. Truth becomes the enemy. Those who speak it become convenient targets. Punishing truth feels easier than punishing oneself. In Rome, late truth exposed not only failure, but hypocrisy. The Senate had long presented calm, control, and continuity as wisdom. When reality finally shattered that image, the contrast was humiliating. Truth revealed that caution had been cowardice, and delay had been decision. This collapse of self-image created anger, and anger sought an outlet. Those who spoke plainly were accused of betrayal, defeatism, or disloyalty, anything to avoid admitting error. There is also fear embedded in late recognition. When truth is finally undeniable, the system senses its own vulnerability. Authority weakens. Control feels fragile. In that moment, silencing truth becomes an act of self-defense. Punishment is used not to correct reality, but to reassert dominance. Rome did not punish truth because it was false. It punished it because it arrived when power could no longer manage its implications. Late truth also threatens narrative. Systems survive on stories about competence, stability, and legitimacy. Truth that arrives too late disrupts these stories completely. It cannot be integrated gently. It demands radical change or collapse. Faced with that choice, many systems choose repression. By punishing truth, they attempt to preserve narrative even as reality collapses beneath it. Perhaps most tragically, those who punish late truth often believe they are protecting order. They see truth-tellers as accelerants of chaos. But in reality, chaos is already present. Punishment does not restore control. It only deepens fracture. The system fights the messenger because it cannot fight the consequences. History shows a cruel pattern. The longer truth is delayed, the harsher the reaction when it finally appears. Early warnings are ignored. Late warnings are punished. In both cases, truth loses, but in different ways. Rome reached the truth too late to be saved, and too late to be forgiven. Truth, when delayed, becomes unbearable. And what is unbearable is often destroyed, not because it is wrong, but because it arrives when the system no longer has the strength to face itself. When Rome still ruled the world, but had already lost itself. There was a moment when Rome commanded armies across continents, dictated laws to distant peoples, and shaped the fate of the known world, yet no longer understood who it was. Power remained vast. Influence remained unquestioned, but purpose had faded. Rome still ruled others while no longer ruling itself. This is the most deceptive phase of decline, when external dominance masks internal emptiness. Rome's institutions continued to expand authority outward, even as cohesion dissolved inward. Conquest became habit rather than necessity. Administration replaced vision. The empire knew how to manage territories, but not how to renew meaning. What once unified Rome, shared struggle, civic responsibility, and belief in a common destiny, slowly dissolved into procedure and privilege. Power survived, identity did not. In this phase, success became automatic. Victory no longer required reflection. Expansion no longer demanded moral justification. Rome acted because it could, not because it knew why. This hollowed its core. When power is no longer tied to purpose, it becomes mechanical. The empire functioned efficiently while drifting aimlessly. Strength existed without direction. The Senate embodied this loss of self. It spoke endlessly of tradition while forgetting why those traditions existed. It preserved forms while neglecting substance. The Republic's language remained, but its spirit faded. Rome was still governed by rituals designed for a city-state, not an empire. The mismatch grew wider every year. Instead of redefining itself, Rome clung to inherited identity long past its relevance. Externally, Rome demanded obedience without loyalty. Internally, it offered stability without meaning. This created a vacuum. People followed rules but no longer believed in them. Citizenship became legal status rather than shared commitment. Authority relied increasingly on enforcement rather than trust. An empire can survive without love, but not without coherence. Perhaps the clearest sign that Rome had lost itself was its confusion about enemies. External threats were feared and fought, but the deeper danger lay within. Loss of civic purpose, erosion of trust, and moral exhaustion. Rome defended borders while neglecting foundations. It mistook dominance for health. Rome still controlled the world, but it no longer understood its own direction. When a system reaches this point, collapse does not require conquest. It only requires time. Power without identity cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Rome's fall was not the moment it lost authority. It was the moment it stopped knowing what that authority was for. When Rome still ruled the world, but had already lost itself. There was a moment when Rome commanded armies across continents, dictated laws to distant peoples, and shaped the fate of the known world, yet no longer understood who it was. Power remained vast. Influence remained unquestioned. But purpose had faded. Rome still ruled others while no longer ruling itself. This is the most deceptive phase of decline, when external dominance masks internal emptiness. Rome's institutions continued to expand authority outward, even as cohesion dissolved inward. Conquest became habit rather than necessity. Administration replaced vision. The empire knew how to manage territories, but not how to renew meaning. What once unified Rome, shared struggle, civic responsibility, and belief in a common destiny, slowly dissolved into procedure and privilege. Power survived, identity did not. In this phase, success became automatic. Victory no longer required reflection. Expansion no longer demanded moral justification. Rome acted because it could, not because it knew why. This hollowed its core. When power is no longer tied to purpose, it becomes mechanical. The empire functioned efficiently while drifting aimlessly. Strength existed without direction. The Senate embodied this loss of self. It spoke endlessly of tradition while forgetting why those traditions existed. It preserved forms while neglecting substance. The Republic's language remained, but its spirit faded. Rome was still governed by rituals designed for a city-state, not an empire. The mismatch grew wider every year. Instead of redefining itself, Rome clung to inherited identity long past its relevance. Externally, Rome demanded obedience without loyalty. Internally, it offered stability without meaning. This created a vacuum. People followed rules but no longer believed in them. Citizenship became legal status rather than shared commitment. Authority relied increasingly on enforcement rather than trust. An empire can survive without love, but not without coherence. Perhaps the clearest sign that Rome had lost itself was its confusion about enemies. External threats were feared and fought, but the deeper danger lay within: loss of civic purpose, erosion of trust, and moral exhaustion. Rome defended borders while neglecting foundations. It mistook dominance for health. Rome still controlled the world, but it no longer understood its own direction. When a system reaches this point, collapse does not require conquest. It only requires time. Power without identity cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Rome's fall was not the moment it lost authority. It was the moment it stopped knowing what that authority was for. Why do things that seem eternal end the fastest? What appears endless often feels exempt from urgency. When something seems permanent, it is no longer protected by attention. Its continuation is assumed, not defended. This is the paradox of longevity. The longer something lasts, the less effort is spent imagining its end. Eternity breeds carelessness, and carelessness accelerates collapse. In Rome, power felt infinite. Centuries of survival created the illusion that the empire existed outside time, immune to the limits that govern ordinary things. This belief did not weaken Rome immediately, it relaxed it. When endings are unimaginable, maintenance replaces renewal, preservation replaces questioning. Systems stop asking why they exist and focus only on how to continue. And in that shift, decay begins. Things that feel endless invite delay. Problems can wait. Reforms can be postponed. The future feels spacious. But time does not expand just because belief does. While attention drifts, reality accumulates pressure. What is not addressed early becomes unmanageable later. The fall is not sudden, it is compressed. Long neglect produces rapid endings. Another reason the eternal ends quickly is rigidity. Permanence encourages fixed identity. When something believes it must remain the same to survive, it loses the ability to adapt. Flexibility feels unnecessary. Change feels threatening. Rome protected its image of itself more fiercely than its capacity to evolve. And when circumstances shifted, that image shattered all at once. Eternity also blinds systems to small losses. Each loss seems insignificant compared to the whole. Influence shrinks, trust erodes, meaning fades, but none of it feels fatal individually. The danger lies in accumulation. By the time loss becomes visible, there is nothing left to recover. The end feels sudden only because the process was ignored. Perhaps most tragically, things that seem eternal attract complacency from those who depend on them most. People build lives, identities, and expectations around permanence. Questioning it feels destabilizing, so they defend the illusion even as reality contradicts it. When collapse arrives, it feels like betrayal, not because it was unpredictable, but because it was unthinkable. History suggests a cruel truth. Nothing ends faster than what believes it cannot end. Eternity is not protection, it is blindness. Rome did not fall because it was weak, but because it felt immortal. And immortality, believed too deeply, becomes the shortest path to an ending. Silence before the fall. Before collapse, there is almost always a pause. Not peace, but quiet. A strange stillness where arguments soften, voices lower, and urgency fades from public language. This silence is not the absence of danger. It is the exhaustion of response. By the time systems reach this stage, they have argued too long, warned too often, and waited too much. Silence becomes a refuge. In Rome, this silence was not imposed at first. It formed naturally. People learned that speaking changed nothing. Warnings were ignored. Reforms were delayed. Accountability dissolved into procedure. Over time, those who once raised concerns stopped doing so, not because the problems vanished, but because resistance felt futile. Silence replaced hope. The elite embraced silence as stability. Fewer confrontations meant fewer risks. Calm language preserved authority. Disagreement was framed as disruption. Unity, even false unity, felt safer than conflict. But silence does not heal fractures. It hides them. The absence of visible tension convinced leaders that control had been restored, when in reality, pressure was building beneath the surface. Among the people, silence carried a different meaning. It was not acceptance, but withdrawal. Trust faded quietly. Participation declined. Civic energy drained away. People complied outwardly while disengaging inwardly. When belief dies, silence follows. And when silence spreads, systems lose the feedback they need to survive. This silence is especially dangerous because it feels like relief. After years of crisis, argument, and fear, quiet feels earned. But it is the quiet of surrender, not resolution. The system mistakes fatigue for peace. Leaders assume the absence of noise means success. In truth, it means the conversation has ended because faith has ended. History shows that revolutions and collapses rarely begin in the noisiest moments. They begin after people stop arguing, after they stop expecting change, after silence becomes the dominant response. At that point, the system has already lost its audience. Rome's fall was preceded not by chaos, but by resignation. The silence before collapse is the sound of a system no longer believed in. And when belief disappears, power has nothing left to stand on. Rome did not end. It only changed its form. Rome did not vanish the moment its institutions collapsed. It dissolved, transformed, and reappeared under new names. What ended was not Rome itself, but one version of it. Power rarely disappears. It migrates. When systems fall, they leave behind habits, structures, and ways of thinking that outlive them. Rome's greatest legacy was not territory or armies. It was a blueprint for authority. After political collapse, Roman law continued. Roman administration continued. Roman concepts of citizenship, hierarchy, governance, and legitimacy continued. Even Rome's enemies adopted its language of power. The empire fell, but its logic survived. This is how systems truly persist, not by staying intact, but by becoming invisible. Rome stopped being a place and became a pattern. What makes this transformation dangerous is that endings feel cleaner than continuations. If Rome had simply disappeared, history could have closed the chapter. But Rome lingered, inside institutions, inside laws, inside assumptions about order and control. The world moved on believing it had escaped Rome, while quietly rebuilding it in different forms. This is why Rome feels eternal, not because it never ended, but because it never fully left. Systems that shape behavior at a deep level do not require borders or emperors. They require habits. They require obedience to procedure. They require belief in hierarchy as natural. Rome embedded these ideas so deeply that they survived its own death. There is also comfort in this transformation. Saying that Rome merely changed shape allows us to avoid confronting finality. It suggests continuity rather than loss, but it also hides responsibility. If Rome never truly ended, then its failures were never fully confronted either. They were inherited. Rome's afterlife teaches a final lesson. Collapse does not guarantee renewal. When a system ends without being understood, it returns disguised as something else. Different symbols, same logic, different names, same patterns. Rome did not end in ruins alone. It ended by becoming familiar again, elsewhere. And as long as its assumptions about power, order, and control remain unquestioned, Rome is not history, it is recurrence. The final question. If a system wants to remain unchanged in a changing world, does it still deserve to survive? This question cuts deeper than politics or history. It strikes at the nature of existence itself. Everything that lives adapts or disappears. Rivers change course, species evolve, minds grow or break. Only dead things remain perfectly the same. And yet, systems built by humans often demand permanence. They ask the world to slow down, to obey old rules, to respect inherited structures long after reality has moved on. A system that refuses to change is not choosing stability. It is choosing comfort. Comfort for those who benefit from it. Comfort for those who fear uncertainty. Comfort for those who mistake familiarity for truth. But comfort is not a moral argument. Survival is not guaranteed by tradition. History does not reward longevity. It tests relevance. When a system insists on remaining unchanged, it shifts the burden of adaptation onto everyone else. People must bend. Reality must wait. Truth must soften its voice. Over time, the system stops serving life and begins demanding sacrifice from it. At that point, survival becomes entitlement rather than necessity, and entitlement is fragile. Does such a system have a right to exist? History suggests a cold answer. Systems have no rights, only conditions. They exist as long as they respond, as long as they listen, as long as they are willing to revise themselves when the world proves them wrong. The moment a system chooses preservation over correction, it begins negotiating its own end. Rome believed it could remain Rome forever. It believed the world should adjust to it, not the other way around. And for a long time, the world did, until it didn't. The final question is not whether systems should change. They must. The real question is whether they will change in time, or insist on staying the same until change is forced upon them. Because when change arrives by force, it is no longer evolution. It is collapse. If this story stayed with you, it's not because it was about Rome. It's because it was about patterns we still live inside. History is not a collection of dates. It is a mirror that only works if you keep looking into it. On this channel, we don't rush conclusions. We don't simplify collapse. We don't tell you what to think. We slow down. We listen. We trace how power, fear, silence, obedience, and belief shape human behavior again and again across centuries. If you're someone who feels that history is not finished, if you sense that the past is still whispering inside modern systems, if you're interested not just in what happened, but why it keeps happening, then this channel is for you. Here we explore empires not as victories, but as warnings. We study power not to admire it, but to understand its cost. We talk about truth not as comfort, but as responsibility. New stories will continue, stories about civilizations that seemed eternal, about systems that collapsed quietly, about people who warned too early, spoke too late, or stayed silent. So if you want to stay with these questions, if you want to keep listening, thinking, and looking deeper, subscribe, not to support the channel, but to stay awake. Because history doesn't repeat itself loudly, it repeats itself quietly, in the minds of those who stop questioning. And this channel exists for one reason only: to keep the questions alive.